Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program that brings you news, views, discussion and opinion on religious liberty events in the United States and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my very special guest on this program is Clifford Goldstein. Now, some of our viewers may know you, Clifford, but I know you mostly as the previous editor of Liberty magazine, and presently you're the editor of the Sabbath School Lesson Quarterlies for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But let's talk about Liberty magazine. Well, it was 7 years, wasn't it, you were editor?
Yeah, I had written for it for a number of years and worked with the
very long
before
association
me.
with it, yes.
And then I came in and I was there about 7 years till I left.
But, you know, religious liberty is a movable feast, and you ate it at that table for a long time.
Yeah.
What are some of your views on it as you look back on it and maybe relate to what's happening now and what you saw moving?
You know, it's very interesting because when you're immersed in it, and I was a lot younger, and I thought I had all the answers, and everything was clear, cut, and dry.
You don't have them now?
No, and in fact, even as the more, you know, it's that classic thing, the more you read, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't learn.
It's a very complex topic.
Yeah, well, that was the thing, it was very complex, and I used to start out with, with this idea that church-state separation was something that emanated from the very nature of God himself, and by promoting church-state separation, we were, you know, tapping into that. And even though I'm for church-state separation, of course, I realize it's much more complicated than that. And
well, it's more complicated than that, but that is a bedrock principle. I remember reading recently the charter of our Seventh-day Adventist Church Religious Liberty Movement, not the magazine, and they put down there that they would fight against anything and everything that diminished the separation of church and state. So it's not very important.
Very funny, though. You know, it's very interesting, too, and from our standpoint, from a prophetic standpoint, how among many secular people, I mean, among many of the religious people, the concept of separation in church and state has now become an anathema.
Well, this is what we need to dwell on, not just this program. I want to take another
I think
program
in some ways
to talk about that.
It's perverted. There are people who do the stupidest things in the name of separation of church and state. Right. Some kid sits down and wants to pray over his meal at lunch in a public school, and they say, you can't do that. That's violating separation of church and state. That's got nothing to do with separation of church and state.
Plus, that's legally false anyhow.
Yeah, of course. You know, that was...
person's right.
So there was, because some things have been done, but the troublesome thing is many traditional churches that traditionally were very strong proponents of church-state separation. Have changed and are now are hostile to it. I can remember many years ago when Pat Robertson was running for president. He had once, before he ran, he had once said something about church-state separation being bad. And at a press conference, I asked him about that thing. And he denied he ever said it. Well, we went back and we found it. Now it's common fare. They all say they're against church-state separation. And
well, and I'd like to talk about it at some length in another show. But Rick Santorum just
well, well, see, that's an example. Nobody 30, 40 years ago, they never would have said anything like that. No. But now everything has changed so much that it's become, a bad thing.
They've moved things around so that it's the secularists and the anti-Americanists almost.
That was one of the things, too, that used to, and I'm sure you experienced this as Liberty editor. There'd be some issue would come up, and I would go down to some meeting in Washington, D.C., and I'm standing here, representing liberty, and you got the ACLU, the American Humanist Society, the American Atheist Society, some extreme other groups that we would have nothing to do with on any other
philosophically
issue. But on this one very narrow thing, and I used to scratch my head sometimes and think, what's wrong with this picture? I mean, the principle that we're standing for is good, and I'm glad we're there doing it, but it sometimes made me quite uncomfortable. What am I doing with these people? I don't agree with them on anything else, but this one thing.
So have you rethought that we need to be separationists in that sense? Or,
well,
what has changed that's made it so apparently unpopular to be a separation?
Well, I think what happened is that a lot of the influence of the Christian right, they have twisted the whole concept of what separation of church and state is. And when I still remember them talking about the war against Christians in America, the war against them. And I mean, these are people, some of these big evangelists. And I think of one in particular, some guy out in Colorado, big industry. I don't know sense going because he's very popular with a lot of people. In fact, I've been in the doghouse more than once.
This wasn't Haggerty, was it?
No. Actually, I was thinking of James Dobson.
Oh.
You know, did a lot of good stuff. In fact, more than once we have something, he would say something about religious liberty that we didn't agree with, and I'd come home and I'd get a tongue lashing from my wife because we raised our kids on the principles of James Dobson. You know, he makes me sleep on the sofa. You say anything more bad about him, but
now I should throw
on
in
the
here
specific area, just on the specific church-state separation area.
But let me put an interjection so that we don't totally badmouth Dobson.
Oh, he's got a lot of good stuff.
You know, I spoke to him once, and he said that his principles of dealing with children, he got absolutely from Raymond Moore, the Seventh-day Adventist child development expert, who got it from Ellen White's writings, which is the Seventh-day Adventist
Well, I always said Dobson was great when he would help you with bedwetting children and men who are going through midlife crises. But get him on the topic of politics, and he made a fool of himself. He was getting in with David Barton, of Wall Builders. He'd bring some guy that even a lot of the Christian right people say.
And as far as separation of church and state, he made a legal fool of himself because his organization was a threat with its non-profit status. So he's become a political operative.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, here's a guy who sat, and he's not the only one, and I don't want to single him out. As I said, he's a good man, he's done a lot of good. But here was a guy sitting on millions of dollars of property that the government lets them have tax-free, and they're bemoaning. You know, what used to get me when I would hear these Christian right people talking about the persecution of Americans. I mean, every day in my desk in Liberty, and you know, we'd get stories of Christians in countries where they're thrown in jail, they're beaten, their property's confiscated, their children are taken away, and you got these multimillionaire evangelists sitting with these big, vast empires and all that, complaining because, oh, they don't let their books aren't put on the bestseller list or something like that, and they're talking about persecution. It was a joke.
Yeah, in reality, they want political power.
Oh, that was the bottom line.
As far as they're frustrated in that, they'll claim they're being persecuted.
So that what better way to get the saints all worked up to tell them that things like not allowing legislated prayer in school is religious persecution, not allowing a statue of the Ten Commandments on public property is religious persecution. They make a big hoopla about the Ten Commandments, but none of them even keep it.
And what it's really done, even hearing you discuss this, it's diverted Christians' attention from real persecution, real trouble in other countries.
Well, it's just part of...
not some concern, but there's a lot of self-absorption in the U.S. about gaining political power, regaining this mythical Christian identity. And you're right, nominally it's always been Christian, nominally, well, more than nominally, it was a Protestant culture as it began. But I've spoken on this program before. Structurally, it never was a government of religion.
No, well,
they're trying to turn it into that.
I remember years ago we had an article in Liberty based on a book called Our Godless Constitution. And you read the U.S. Constitution, it never says anything about God, and the only time it says anything about religion is to restrict what the government can do. And people had a hoopla because sometimes they mix up the Declaration of Independence with the Constitution, but that has nothing to do with us today.
Well, it's a founding document, but it isn't legal in the sense of the Constitution.
It has nothing to do with the way we run our country. We don't run our country.
And it was the product of just a couple of people. It wasn't.
And if if someone want to hang me for this, if you read the Declaration of Independence, I mean, Jefferson was so over the top with that. He was so you study the history. It was a radical document.
I'm an Australian background. I've got to be cautious on what I say about that.
It was a radical document. Sure, we're glad we broke away from England and it all worked out fine in the end. But the bottom line is, people, the Declaration of Independence is not how we run our country. It's not how it's the Constitution. And what do you know? There's nothing about God in the Constitution at all. And that's not how people want to view. And they talk about the mythical days of American history. Well, the days of slavery? Yeah, what a great Christian nation we were. We had slaves, and then in parts of the country, it took a civil war to free the slaves, and then it took another 100 years, the U.S. Supreme Court to help get parts of the country to treat African Americans.
And women to vote, for that matter.
Women to vote. Yeah, all this in our Christian nation. I prefer the Christian America today than the Christian America of the Jim Crow laws.
What I tell people, without meaning and trying to demean the Constitution, but when you're talking about church-state issues and higher loyalties to God, you've got to remember the Constitution is a human construct, and all human constructs are fallible. more than fallible, they're a product of their environment.
Yeah.
And the Constitution is a pretty solid document, and it's serving the U.S. well. Yeah. But it's not without its flaws.
That's why they have the amendment process. That's why
absolutely.
we've amended it.
And Scalia, who has some interesting ideas, but that's his view. You don't like it? Change it.
Yeah,
amend
well,
it.
of course, the whole point is not very easy to do.
No, by design.
But they made that
by
purposely.
Design.
Yeah, but they, of course, it took a civil war to get them to free slaves. So yeah, it was flawed from the start. And not everybody, people understand that. But
what did you think recently? It was about a year and a half, 2 years ago. We had the congressman reading the Constitution as a public exercise.
Well, that's fine. I mean, it is the document, and ideally we're supposed to follow.
Were you impressed by them? What grade would you have given them?
Oh, I don't know. And who's going to? The Constitution is not simple.
No.
You got to take your time and you got to read it. It's complicated.
What impressed me after listening, they're not reading it. That's the message I got out of it. That's the takeaway. Yeah. So they were missing sections.
It was political showmanship.
Yes.
It was political showmanship. That's all it was.
And the Constitution should be cherished and not used as a political ploy like that.
Well, the funny thing, too, is I thought about it. You got this founding document. I mean, the instruction manual for my Honda Civic is about 5 times the size of the founding document of a country now. Back then.
Yeah, but it only has a 3-year warranty.
Yeah.
The Constitution's lasted a couple of centuries.
Yeah. So anyway.
So when you were editing it, though, what are some of the topics that stuck with you over the years that you found most significant?
It was fascinating to see how our concept of religious liberty had changed over the years. And so, it's funny, too, how everybody says that, the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Well, notice it says Congress shall make no law. If, there's a big argument over original intent. Well, if you went back to what the founders originally intended, I live in Maryland, if the way the Constitution was originally written, if the state of Maryland, which was a Catholic state, wanted to make Roman Catholicism the official religion of the state,
they could.
There was absolutely nothing in the Constitution to stand in the way. In fact, some have argued that the whole reason they wrote the First Amendment was to tell the states that had established churches, our federal government will leave your established churches alone. And then, what do you know, 150 years later, or whatever, starting in the early 20th century, they start incorporating these to the states, which I'm glad they did.
But you hit it on the nail on the head before.
Upside down.
The pivotal thing on many issues, but particularly religious liberty, is the Civil War.
Yeah.
The Civil War
they say what the
changed the power from the sovereign states to a federal government.
Yeah.
And I studied American history and loved it. But the takeaway I got, and I'm sure I'm right on it because it's unambiguous early on, these were 13 sovereign states, countries. They saw
it wasn't going to work.
They weren't giving away sovereignty.
Yeah, but
they were compacting together for common defense and commerce between the states. But
remember the time, and that was right after the war with England. They were very ambitious and very jealous for their sovereignty, and so on. So I remember even reading somewhere, someone said, I'm willing to fight and die for New Jersey. Yeah. Okay, so they were very reticent about that. But 100 years go by.
No, it changed. There's a new reality. But we need to understand where that reality came from. And when these original intent guys are starting to look at it, they're wrong on the Constitution, and it's creating an American republic, a Christian republic. It didn't do that. But as you say, the sovereign states, I think that they expected that. That's how it was. They had established churches. Nobody was uncomfortable with it except the people in the other state. They didn't want it being forced.
Well, they were uncomfortable if you happen to be in the minority of that. In fact, they say one of the whole reasons that you got the First Amendment was the Virginia Baptists went to James Madison and said, we are not going to support this Constitution if you don't put a Bill of Rights in there, because we need it to protect us, because the Anglican Church was the established church.
Okay, we'll be back after a short break. Interesting discussion. I can hardly stop talking myself, but we'll be back. Stay with us. Back to the Liberty Insider before the break with guest Clifford Goldstein, a former editor of Liberty magazine. We were getting wound up on history of the Constitution and of the U.S. experiment with those 13 colonies that had their established churches, but on a federal level, clearly religion was pretty much, not so much off the table, but it was a clear separation between the civil and the religious.
I know, and that's what I said. That's one of the big farces that you hear about how they this golden age of everybody was religious.
It was a rowdy experiment from the beginning.
It
worked out well.
Near what they. Oh yeah, it's amazing that it's worked out as well as it has, but it's not this golden age when everybody was religious and everybody was going to church.
And there was a good amount of religious persecution. The Mormon, Mitt Romney's making a good run for a Republican nomination. But Mormons have been very severely persecuted, death penalty at one point. Extermination order. What was the governor of should remember the state.
Yeah, I don't know, but they had a very hard time in this country.
And then the Catholics, there was rioting where Catholics were lynched on sight. Of course, Ku Klux Klan, that was a major leg of their hate agenda.
I know, so this whole idea of this golden age of religion and everybody was.
We're probably in the golden age now.
Well, and
but prophetically we know that it's sort of
for certain people, it's the freedoms we have now are amazing. We ought to. It's very easy, though, we take them for granted. We do take it for granted. We just assume everybody can say what they want. And I can still remember years ago seeing, I don't even think I had become Liberty editor yet, but I remember I was downtown D.C., and this is during the time of the Rambo movies. And they had a shirtless Sylvester Stallone, all muscles, and on top they photographed in Ronald Reagan, and the picture was Ronbo. And I remember, and it said Rambo, and I remember a friend of mine who ended up becoming a lawyer, we looked at that, and we, at that moment, we realized 3/4 of the countries of the world, you would have done that to the leader, you would have been, in jail. And we realized, look at, this is what freedom is about. And it was amazing. And I think the amazing thing, too, that always gets me when I read history was, you think of where the founders came from. Most of them, they were born in America, but they came out of the tradition of Europe, of all this persecution, of all where I remember John Locke.
That was their salutary lesson. They wanted to avoid that.
Yeah, it was amazing.
But also, they were clearly a product of the philosophical reasoning that came through the British.
Well, they claimed that they were Englishmen. They claimed their fight against King George was the rights of Englishmen. And it was funny because England at that time, I mean, we would look back at it horrified at some of the laws they had, but at that time, many of the people on the continent looked to England. They actually had a real parliament. You didn't have absolute monarchs. You had a certain amount. And I think the influence of John Locke, on that had.
Well, on the back page of Liberty recently, we had a quote from John Locke, and I tried to get the artist and the designer to have a painting with John Locke like Teletubbies, where he was the sun and his face was shining out of the sun onto Washington, because John Locke was central.
Well, they said in many ways, I remember reading one historian said, Jefferson copied Locke. Okay, but in many ways they got a lot of good stuff. But even back then, Locke, we say, as progressive as he was, Locke wanted religious freedom for everybody except for Catholics and I think atheists.
Well, they had a narrow.
Because Catholics are afraid their allegiance was going to be to the Pope. And atheists, they figured they didn't have to worry about lying or anything like that, because doing anything wrong, because they didn't worry about the retributive God. Now,
remember, on the British system still, we've heard you get the Bible there and you swear on the Bible. An atheist's oath and word was not to be relied on.
So again, from our perspective today, see, in many ways it is an evolving thing. It evolves, it changes, and ideally you'd like to think it's changing for the better.
And this is what I've said on this program and in Liberty. It's evolving, and in many ways, this is the best and the worst of times. Because we've evolved in some ways to improve our understanding, and the concept of religious freedom and even separationism has become enshrined in people's thinking. But the threats have never been worse. The hazards have never been higher, and I think we're almost coming to the point where it's getting better and getting worse, and something is going to give.
All I know is, it would take something radical, something major. It's very scary when you think of...
Dominionism is a radical view.
Well, the thing is, I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and there are all sorts of people in the intelligence community there, and they are the most paranoid group of people you'll ever want to meet.
More than Liberty editors?
I know they are. No, they're about on par with you. But they are very paranoid, and I remember I had one friend who said, I wish I didn't know the things I know. He wouldn't tell me what they were, but you could see the fear on his face, and it could take something... Boom. I remember a while back reading in say this, in a magazine called Cigar Aficionado. Okay,
Aficionado?
Yeah, Aficionado, yeah. And it was General Tommy Franks. And he warned.
I remember that article.
You know, yeah, he warned about, oh, you read Cigar Aficionado too, huh?
On the newsstand.
Yeah.
My father was a temperance leader.
Yeah,
I do not subscribe.
Now we know, our secret's out. But he warned about how all it would take, some kind of major catastrophe, and all these freedoms. You know, I remember after 9/11.
And that's really where I've come to. I believe we're one 9/11 type event away from.
I mean, we've argued over this before, but I remember you and I sat in your office and argued over this. After 9/11, I really didn't care if back then John Ashcroft wanted to peek in my bedroom window or read my email, you know, or listen to my phone conversations. If that was going to keep Osama bin Laden from nuking me and my family, let him do it. You know,
you're a typical American, right?
Well, there's a balance. There's a balance.
In retrospect, though, that's a very dangerous.
Of course.
Giving away of
coming here, on the way here, I read something. I saw something in the airport in Wired, and I'm not sure because NSA, the National Security Agents, charter is for overseas. They're not allowed to spy on Americans. Supposedly they'll put them in jail. In fact, after that scandal came out a while back, I knew one of the guys at the FBI interrogated for 14 hours, he said, because they thought he was the one that did the leak. But according to Wired, they said NSA is getting the technology where they will be able to know every phone call, every text message, every internet search, everything. Now, first of all, I'm not sure NSA does that, but I mean, you think a little bit about the Big Brother society, but
we're in Big Brother
it can be abused. It can be abused, but at the same time, they're probably doing it in an attempt for security. But if the wrong people got a hold of it and the power got in, then they.
What's that statement? You know, those who are willing to give away freedoms for a threat.
What's that?
What's that quote?
Oh, was it a quote from Franklin?
Yeah,
those that are willing to give away freedom for security deserve neither. Or something like that. Well,
I'm afraid we're getting into that mindset.
Yeah, well, there's a balance there. There's a balance.
And religious freedom, if it's nothing else, it's a personal matter.
Yeah.
So to have a government or indeed other individuals trying to get into your soul to decide what you should believe and how you should act, that's not good for religious
well, of course
liberty.
not, but no one's necessarily saying that's where they're going right now. That could happen.
I don't believe they intend that, but that's a byproduct of this intrusion that technology is granting to us.
Yeah, I mean, much as we love our gizmos and we love our technology, I mean, I can't live without this thing. But it was rather disturbing, wasn't it, when you found out they could track you?
Your extra girlfriend, Siri, right?
Yeah, well, no, I don't have Siri yet. I'm waiting for the upgrade. But the other thing, too, is there's software you could get that I hear, that if you get it on here, your phone is off. Somebody can hear your conversation, know where you are. So in one sense, it is, as much as we...
things have changed since you started with Liberty. This was just barely thought about as
they didn't have any
20 years ago.
Yeah,
and we've just rapidly moved into an era where everything is the public's concern, or the government's concern.
Yeah, well, there's very little privacy now. If you really want privacy, I don't know how you're going to get it. I mean, it's, they can track where you're going. I even think about Google. I'm sure 30 years ago, what you could do with Google Maps, was probably top secret technology in the Pentagon.
Well, it was. We know that.
Yeah, top secret technology.
They still have a higher resolution.
Every schnook with a cell phone's got Google Maps, and you can see. Can you imagine what they can do now?
Well, I know one thing they're doing now. They can go down and look at your house and see if you've built a deck there, and then did you have a building permit for it? Oh, well, that's just the day and age we live in, and I don't think it's gonna... Sort of Corrie ten Boom's story, no hiding place.
Yeah, I don't think that there's any turning back at this point, so...
But there's still a need for Liberty Magazine, isn't there?
Oh, yeah.
And I think we need to defend it, and see what you say of this. We need to defend it not so much from a constitutional level, which was a nice civil advantage, but from a biblical moral level.
Sure. I mean, God created humans free. God created us free, and the greatest example of the freedom we have is the cross, because Jesus died on the cross because he gave humanity freedom. And freedom was so sacred, so fundamental, that rather than take it away, God took a chance. He took a chance creating these free beings, even knowing what we were going to do. But our freedom was so sacred, he said, hey, I'm going to go to the cross rather than deny people freedom. And if that's God's attitude towards it, how could we, as beings made in his image, have any other attitude about it?
The Apostle Paul spoke of the gospel of liberty, as he put it. So as editor of Liberty magazine, I certainly can concur that religious liberty is vital and integrally connected to the gospel message that we are called to give. In talking with Clifford Goldstein of his tenure as editor of Liberty magazine and remembering back to his predecessor, Roland Hegstead, I know that there are some great topics that have been covered and some great battles that have been fought from the editor's position and through the magazine. We are dealing with life and death issues, and religious liberty is never going to be immaterial. Sometimes it might put us against special interest groups. Sometimes, as I've sometimes even humorously noted, even on a Liberty board meeting, we'll need to hold fast and project a very serious position that the magazine is pursuing. But above all, when we talk about religious freedom, as Paul reminded us, religious freedom is the gospel. Religious freedom is speaking about and promoting Jesus Christ and his love. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steve.